This book, The Last Wish, is an anthology work, which means that it is a collection of short stories. It does not tell one single overarching plot, but rather tells a bunch of different adventures that Geralt of Rivia had as a younger Witcher. If you've just, you have a sort of an interest in the timeline here. Every book, all of these novels that we're going to be reading, they come before the video games. So you don't have to play the video games or know the video games at all to be able to understand what's going on here, because this is where it starts chronologically, is in The Last Wish. And while they are separate individual stories, each chapter that we'll be reading through, a lot of these will set up very important events and relationships for the book saga that will be coming up, which does tell an overarching plot, but also the video games too, especially The Witcher 3. The Witcher 3 has lots and lots of references to these books. Chapter 1 is more or less the first adventure, if you want to call it that, of Geralt's that gives him some notoriety, brings him some fame. His first job that he takes that essentially gets his name on the map in this world. For those of you who have played the first Witcher game, there is a cinematic cutscene that plays on the title screen. And this chapter is essentially, or that cutscene essentially summarizes what this chapter is all about. It is Geralt's encounter with the Striga, that he attempts to undo the curse. This is Foltest, the king of Temeria. His daughter was transformed into a Striga, and Geralt is attempting to undo that curse and bring her back to her humanity. The second chapter is actually one of my favorite stories in this entire universe. It doesn't have so much of a tie into some of the later stories or the overarching plots of The Witcher as the later chapters will have an actual bearing on things to come. But I just really love the character work. I love the dialogue. I find that it's just very witty, very clever, and very well told, and I'm fascinated by the story that's told in Chapter 2. So, the structure of this book has us jumping between sort of the present time, where Geralt is essentially recovering at the Temple of Melitla. Neneka, Mother Neneka, is sort of the priestess that runs this temple. Neneka is worried about Geralt, seems to think that there's some kind of possibly curse or something that is affecting him. He's not as agile, he's making mistakes. She thinks there's something deeper going on that is happening to him, and wants him to go through sort of a ritual that he's not really keen on. He doesn't really want to do it. And so she's sort of trying to convince him to allow them to look into and investigate possibly something more sinister going on with him. So they're kind of telling that story, and then in between that, they're going back and sort of exploring some of Geralt's, previous adventures and stories. And the first one, again, is the tale of Foltest, King Foltest of Temeria. Foltest was in love with his sister, and they explain how that union brought about this daughter, and there was a curse placed on the daughter by someone who was vengeful. And essentially, Foltest has been bringing professionals in to try and reverse the curse, and does not want her killed. But there are other people who are willing to pay to have her killed and just have this thing over with, because the Striga is killing 50 people a year, and it's a really big problem. It's been going on and on and on. And Geralt comes into the situation and decides he's going to try to reverse the curse. And so rather than kill the Striga, he's going to go the more difficult route and try to actually bring the girl back. Okay, so let's take a look at my notes for this chapter. Now I want to talk a little bit about dialogue. I've talked about this in podcasts on the past, even in some of the videos I've done. I'm working on a video right now that should be coming out on Monday that's all about dialogue, how to write good dialogue. And one thing that, is commonly, I guess, like, looked down upon or that you try to avoid as a writer is writing what's called as-you-know dialogue, which is where two characters are talking, both of them are completely aware of the situation at hand, they know exactly, they're both in the know of what's happening, but the audience isn't. So the characters will speak to each other to describe things both of them already know. There isn't any reason that they would say the things they're saying. They're only saying it for the sake of the audience to give expository dialogue and to fill us in on what we need to know. This particular paragraph, I think, is a decent example of how to do this without it feeling too contrived. Because you can't avoid it altogether. I don't think it's possible to completely eliminate as-you-know dialogue. Sometimes it's just necessary, because the only alternative in certain cases is to go all the way back to the beginning of a character's life and follow them through every step of their life so we have all the context, and that nobody has time for that. You can't do that as a writer. You can't detail every single thing that's ever happened in the world and take people through step beginning to end so that everyone knows what's going on. Sometimes you just have to rely on a little as-you-know dialogue to fill some people in. And as far as this goes, I think that this is a way that can work. And sometimes people will do that. Even if you're talking with someone and they know your position on something, you're just trying to vent the frustrations that you're feeling, right? You're just trying to get that out. And sometimes, you'll cover stuff that somebody you're talking to is aware of, right? Just because it's not about what you're saying as much as expressing your feelings about it. So he's talking about, how all these monsters are popping up and things are crazy in the world right now. These are all things a Witcher would know, because this is a Witcher's freaking job, is to go out and take care of all these monsters that are popping up. But he is expressing this with just this frustration, this sort of attitude of venting. So in terms of writing as-you-know dialogue, I actually feel this is one of the better examples of how to do it right, so that you can fill people in. So, because the people reading, they don't know what a Witcher is yet. So this is meant to fill us in on a Witcher's job, which is hunting monsters, right? So this, as well as the few examples I'm going to be showing afterwards over here, are, I think, really good preludes to the style of dialogue that Sapkowski writes with. And I really like it. If you're going to get into this series, this book series, the Witcher book series, you're going to have to like witty, clever dialogue, because that is mostly what these books are. That's not to say that they don't have any action. There's plenty of action in them. But I think where they really shine is in character interaction. The way that characters talk, and sort of the philosophies that are given through their dialogue and through their conversation, and the sort of battle of wits that happens between characters. That, to me, is really riveting. I really like it. I really like his style of dialogue. One thing that he does is he'll take these asides. He'll be there, you'll have a character going through essentially like a paragraph monologue, just talking and talking and talking. But what he'll do is he'll sort of interject with these asides, what I like to call non sequiturs. He doesn't do it to the point where it totally derails the conversation. The plot continues to move forward, the story continues moving, but it still feels like it brings this personality and this character to the way that the characters talk. He does this quite frequently. Here, he's talking about some people who had come by earlier. They were shoemakers, and then he breaks off to say, "Why are shoemakers so foolish, Geralt? I don't know." And then he tries to get him back on track. And the Witcher's Castellan, have they tried? He keeps him, he keeps asking him questions because he's looking for particular information. There's a lot of that kind of personality in the dialogue, and it only gets stronger and stronger as the series goes. Okay, this part here is a really good example of subtext. Not subtext in dialogue necessarily, but in the narration, just the author's narration, right? So during the course of trying to get this story going that he's telling us, he needs to give us information about who Witchers are, what do they do, and rather than just flat out coming out and saying, Witchers are expert monster hunters who have heightened abilities and they use alchemy, he doesn't just flat out on the nose tell you that stuff, right? Here, it says the following day, late in the evening, the miller was brought to the small chamber above the guardhouse allocated to the Witcher. He was led in by a soldier in a hooded coat. So they're bringing this miller in because the miller's the one person who has actually escaped the Striga and can give information about it. So Geralt's looking for information. Says the conversation did not yield any significant results. The miller was terrified. He mumbled and stammered, and his scars told the Witcher more than he did. That line right there, his scars told him more than the Witcher, or more than he did. The Striga could open her jaws impressively wide and had extremely sharp teeth, including very long upper fangs, 4 of them, 2 on each side. Her claws were sharper than a wildcat's but less curved, and it was only because of that the miller had managed to tear himself away. So we learn about Geralt as a character through that description of the Striga, right? Because Geralt could read all of those details about the Striga simply by looking at the scars that were left on the miller. And that tells us about his expertise as a witcher, as a tracker, as a monster hunter, way better than just coming out and being like, he's an expert tracker, he can read scars on a person. He doesn't need to tell us that on the nose. He can just say that he noticed these scars and this is what he gathered, this is what he knows about the Striga now, based on the scars. And that tells us, I think, way better than just flat out saying it, how skilled of a witcher he is, right? Subtext like that is, in my opinion, always preferable to being explicit or just describing something flat out. This is the part where Geralt is now at the old castle where Foltest used to live before the Striga took over and started killing people, right? He's moved to a new castle now. But he goes into the old castle. It's not, night has not, come yet, so the sun has not yet set. He's waiting, essentially, for the time to confront the Striga. And we have this character who's come in, Ostrit, who is essentially trying to pay him to leave, wants things to stay the same. Does not want him to reverse the curse or try to kill the Striga at all, just wants him to go away. And so this is a good example, I feel, again, a prelude to even better things to come, of what this book series does really well. And that is that here you're going to get Geralt's philosophy about what should be done, about the ethics of it, right? It'll be easier to remove Foltest from the throne if the Striga frightens the people even more, he's asking Ostrit. If the royal madness completely disgusts both magnates and common folk, am I right? So he's accusing him of wanting to overthrow Foltest, and that's the reason he doesn't want Geralt to do this. I came here by way of Redania and Novigrad. There is much talk there. Much talk that there are those in Wisdom who look to King Vizimir as their savior and true monarch, but I, Lord Ostrit, do not care about politics or the successions of thrones or revolutions in palaces. I'm here to accomplish my task. Have you ever heard of a sense of responsibility and plain honesty? About professional ethics? Right, so he's making his case about, he's taking a bit of a moral high ground here, right? And, makes fine points and sharp points, right? Obviously understands the true reason why Ostrit is doing this. But the response here is good, too. Careful to whom you speak, you vagabond, Ostrit yelled furiously, placing his hand on the hilt of his sword. I've had enough of this. I'm not accustomed to hold such discussions. Look at you. Ethics? Codes of practice? Morality? Who are you to talk? A brigand who's barely arrived before he starts murdering men? Who bends double the Foltest and behind his back bargains with Velerad like a hired thug? And you dare to turn your nose up at me, you serf? Play at being a knowing one, a magician, you scheming witcher? Be gone before I run the flat of my sword against your gob. So, what I feel Sapkowski does really well in these stories is he really does give weaknesses into everyone's philosophies, right? He does a good job of pointing out, like, this person might have a really good point and have a really good reason for believing the things they do and for the motivation they have to join the side that they do, live the way they live, whatever. Even if it's morally questionable, he helps us understand where that person's coming from and why they're doing the things they do. And there's never, I don't want to say never, but it's often that these characters can debate their philosophies back and forth and both have very credible places to be coming from, right? Like, it is extremely hypocritical for Geralt, who is the hero of our story, to be talking about ethics, professional ethics and honesty and morality, when he literally walked into a tavern and just, like, murdered these two dudes just to get the attention of the Castellan and the king. So there's a lot of moral gray area in the philosophies that these characters hold, and their debates and their witty banter back and forth, to me, is very engaging for that reason. And this is just a taste, like I said, of some of the better stuff that's to come in later books even. And here in the next section, he continues to sort of like, yell and scream and demean and talk down to the Witcher while he's tied up. And it isn't until he realizes what's happening. You damned murderer, where are you? Untie me immediately, you louse. He's still, like, shouting at him. Geralt just very, very short, distinct, often one-word answers. Quiet. You're leaving me to be devoured by her? He's starting to realize what's going on. I'll let you go, but not now. You scoundrel! To distract the Striga? Yes. And then we get a pause here. Ostrid didn't say anything. He stopped wriggling and lay quiet. So he's having a moment to realize he's gonna die, right? He's beginning to come to terms with that. That has hit him. And immediately what he starts doing is confessing. And I think that this is a really clever way to fill us in on what actually happened, how Foltest's daughter became the Striga, basically, right? So they give some more exposition here, but it's all done through this confession. And I thought that was a really clever way, again, to do expository dialogue, not necessarily as you know dialogue, but expository dialogue in a way that feels absolutely natural. I love how he starts just asking Witcher, over and over again. He's very important to him that the Witcher is listening to his confession. Witcher, yes, it's true that I wanted to overthrow Foltest. I'm not the only one, but I am the only one who wanted him dead. I wanted him to die in agony, to go mad, to rot alive. Do you know why? He doesn't say anything. And he says, I loved Ada, which was King Foltest's sister. And he says there, the king's sister. King's mistress, the king's trollop. I loved her. And then pause. Witcher, are you there? He's making sure you're listening. I am. Then he goes on. I know what you're thinking, but it wasn't like that. Believe me, I didn't cast any spells. I don't know anything about magic. Only once, in anger, did I say... Only once. Witcher, are you listening? Again. I just love the flow of this conversation. It just feels... I don't know, it just feels really real and natural. I am. It's his mother, the old queen. It must be her. She couldn't watch him. So he's trying to deflect blame. So he's reached the point where he goes, I couldn't have done this. No, it wasn't me. It must have been her. She hated their relationship. It must have been the queen. It wasn't me. I only once, tried to persuade them, but Ada, Witcher, I was besetted, and I said, Witcher, was it me? Me? He's slowly realizing what he's done, accepting what he's done, right? It doesn't matter anymore. Witcher, is it nearly midnight? So that was all done in a very short space, too. The pacing of that conversation was really good. Gave us all the information we need to know to fill in the story, all the questions we have left about it. But it doesn't do so at the cost of just expositing, telling us everything that happened, detailing what was said, why those words had power, anything like that. We don't need to know any of that. We just need to know he was responsible for the fact that this happened. And then we have the rest of the chapter, of course, is the fight against the Striga. For the sake of time today, I'm not going to talk too much about how the action is structured, because there's so many other things that I want to get into. But, eventually sleeps in the coffin, wakes up the next day, and King Foltest's daughter is back to being human again. He did take a nasty injury from the fight, and that's what essentially leads him to Mother Nenica to receive healing. And then we jump into the next chapter. The next chapter is primarily just dialogue. It's two characters talking back and forth, and revealing telling the story of what happened to this character, how he became cursed, and all this stuff. But it's just the personality, you just get attached to the character by the way they speak. The way they speak reveals so much about who they are, and it's so lively and expressive, and it just makes you fall in love with the people, right? I wanted to talk first, before we get into that, though, because we come back to the Temple of Melitele. What I do really like is the character of Nenica. I love her. And for the same reason that I love Nivellen and everything that's coming in a minute. Because the dialogue, some writers, they'll write dialogue and it feels like almost anyone in the story could say it, right? Like, it's just dialogue, it's just words, and you could attribute those words to anyone, you could fill them in with anyone else, but I think good writers are able to set apart different characters by how they talk. Like, you could just read the dialogue without any descriptor coming afterwards saying, said Nenica, or replied Geralt, without something to describe who's saying it. You could read the dialogue and attribute that to the character. You know that, this is something this character would say. And I feel like he does a really good job with that. Nenica's personality is very apparent in the words that she chooses to say. It tells us a lot about who she is. And I just love her personality. She's this fearless woman with brutal honesty and sharp wit, and a little bit of like a motherly condescension, right? But what I love about it is that even though she's talking down at you, she's lecturing you, there's never anything about it that feels mean-spirited. She's never being cruel about it. There's always a sense that there's love behind what she's saying. A little bit of tough love, right? But still, she doesn't ever mean anything, by it. She obviously cares about Geralt. She obviously cares about these, these priestesses at the temple. But obviously she's dealing with a lot. She sees a lot of stupidity, and there's part of her sort of just this cynical, sharp-witted person that sort of comes out, is kind of forced out from having to deal with all this crap that's going on. And I really love that about her, is that she experiences that, she has that sense of frustration, but she's never mean-spirited in the way that she talks to people. The fact that she can say something like, don't grin like an idiot, but it does not feel mean, right? They're just kind of going back and forth. It's just banter, and I really like that about her. However, that being said, we flip over to this other page, and this is an example of dialogue that I don't think is very good. So she's trying to convince him to go through this ritual, essentially, to sort of like I was saying earlier, look into if there's something deeper going on with Geralt right now. She says, Iola isn't a medium or a mentally ill soothsayer. The child enjoys the goddess's favor. Don't pull silly faces, if you please. Again, another one of those sort of insertions of just a little bit of flavor to the dialogue, right? As I said, your view on religion is known to me. It's never particularly bothered me, and no doubt it won't bother me in the future. I'm not a fanatic. You've a right to believe that we're governed by nature and the force hidden within her. You can think that the gods, including my Melitele, are merely a personification of this power invented for simpletons so they can understand it better, accept its existence. According to you, that power is blind. But for me, Geralt, faith always allows you to expect what my goddess personifies from nature, order, law, goodness, and hope. She's explaining to him what he believes. She's explaining to him what she believes. She's explaining to him things they definitely have already talked about in the past and already know. The only reason that she's saying this is for our benefit, and what I found so funny is that right after that, Geralt says, I know. So obviously he knows this, right? This is an example of, as you know, dialogue that I think is not the best. I think that you could give this information through more subtext. Wasn't the biggest fan of just flatly like describing what Geralt's philosophy on religion is to him, which of course he knows. So here we get to Nivellen, right? Who I love this character. I love the personality of this character. And I love his catchphrase too. So we have him, he's, essentially bear-like, this monstrous face and claws, and comes running in and threatens him, get out of here, clear off. But Geralt is not fazed by it, and Nivellen sort of slowly is transforming or taking off this mask of this vicious beast, and slowly is becoming himself. And you kind of see that through the progression of the dialogue too. Here is clear off while you're still one piece, roared the creature, less sure of himself. Because if you don't, then what? Interrupts Geralt. The monster suddenly gasped and tilted his monstrous head. These mannerisms that all of a sudden transform the character entirely, right? Look at him, isn't he brave? He spoke calmly, baring his fangs and glowering at Geralt with bloodshot eyes. Lower that iron, if you please. All of a sudden he's becoming, polite almost. And it's just like a huge 180. It's just like, whoa, like, this character is interesting, right? It's or maybe it's customary wherever you come from to threaten people with swords in their own courtyards. It is customary, Geralt agreed, when faced with people who greet their guests with a roar and a cry that they're going to tear you to pieces. And then his catchphrase, pox on it. I really like it. Again, pox on it is a really good way to establish Nivellen as kind of his own person. He has his own mannerisms, his own quirks, his own way of talking, and it really gives him a very unique personality. Now, I've talked a lot in podcasts and things about repetitiousness, right? And he says pox on it a lot during the course of this chapter. I think it's something like 8 or 9 times or something like that during their conversation. And I want to point out really quick that there is a difference between the repetition of pox on it, or pox, like the way he sort of just exclaims, sort of curses something with that phrase. There's a difference between repeating the same sentiment in a conversation. You're trying to communicate an idea to someone, and you keep repeating that idea over and over and over again, especially if it's meant to have heavy impact the first time. There's a difference between that and giving the character a quirk like this. He says pox on it all the time, but he's not repeating a sentiment. It's just his way of cursing something. Expressing frustration. And again, what I really like about it is that it uniquely establishes this character as a separate person in his speech patterns from anyone else. So you don't have to always rely on the descriptors afterwards. Said Nivellen, roared Nivellen, whatever it is, replied Nivellen. You don't have to rely on that, because you can just write a line of dialogue, put the quotations on, say nothing as a descriptor, and you know that Nivellen said that. And I really, really like that. I think that Sapkowski's very good at that. That's one of the things he does the best, and one of the reasons I like these books is the banter and the wit between the characters and their unique ways of talking that reveal, who they are. And I find the dialogue in his books fascinating, and it's my favorite part about them. This was a really good example of show, don't tell in book form. I talked about show, don't tell in one of my videos in the series that what's it called? Understanding Story, right? I talked, one of the episodes in Understanding Story, I guess the second episode, is about show, don't tell. And I had someone in the comments kind of rebuttal or try to rebuttal what I was saying, being like, well, I can tell that you don't read a lot of literature because that's all books are. You know, you have to tell. And I was like, okay, no, hold on. No. Show, don't tell absolutely applies to prose as well. And this is a really good example. We really get to see from, you know, we're not literally seeing it, right? But the way that things are described help us visualize it. Rather than just telling us the moon is shining, right? You describe the reflection or the glint of blue light off of the broken glass on the floor. You know, you set up a visual that people can, you know, can use to sort of like see what the author is seeing in their own mind. That's what show, don't tell is all about in writing prose. And I felt that this one was really good. This is when Geralt basically reveals that he's a witcher, and his job is to hunt monsters, right? In Nivellen, there's a silence. Candle flames pulsated, flicked upwards in thin wisps of fire, glimmering in the cut crystal chalices. Cascades of wax trickled down the candlestick. Now, this serves two purposes. One, it helps us see the room they're in, but two, it gives weight to that pause, right? We have a couple of sentences here that is, rather than saying there was a pause, then continues on with what they say next, I think it's way more effective and it gives a lot of weight to that pause. They're sitting there going like, ooh, like there's an impact in that pause because he describes the room. He describes the candles flickering. He describes the wax trickling down the candlestick. You can see those as shots almost in your mind if this were made into a live action film. You have a couple of different shots there that give a punctuation and a weight to this silence as Nivellen considers this and goes, wait a minute, are you here to kill me, right? That's the subtext. He's thinking this here. So really, really liked that moment, really added some weight to what was happening in the dialogue. But eventually someone stumbles in there. He scares the guy, but then feels bad and gives him some money, and that was a huge mistake because now people are coming wanting money, and they bring their daughters with them, and the daughters live with him for a year, and he gives them a dowry, so to speak. You know, he pays them for this, so he can have some company because he's so lonely. And he does this for many, many years, but now he's tired of that. He's no longer accepting human partners, and he's essentially, he doesn't know this, but he is in a relationship with a vampire. Doesn't know it's a vampire, but this vampire is actually in his sleep controlling him and sending him out to kill people, basically helping her find victims. And so, anyways, he's fighting this vampire. Geralt comes back, realizes what the monster really is, and comes back to fight it. And then this is the last note that I made, and it is, this didn't, when I read this, I was kind of confused by it. But when you listen to the audiobook, it makes a lot more sense because Peter Kenny, who's doing the narration, he does great voices and a lot of great accents. If you don't have the audiobook, I suggest looking into it. There was a sale on it recently. It was like $5, really, really cheap. But he adds so much personality. And what I like to do is to listen to the audiobook and read at the same time so that I can kind of get his interpretation of the character voices and his like lively way of describing action, but I can still, you know, pause and look at how the prose is actually structured and sort of analyze that part of it too. But in the audiobook, his voice is changing from the monster voice into, you know, the voice of the man, Nivellen. During the course of this whole thing, the head fell onto the gravel. There are fewer and fewer monsters, and I, what am I? And he's sort of just like slowly transforming his voice during the course of reading that section, and it's very much clear in the audiobook that he's transforming back into a human again. I mean, you'll eventually get that by the time you get to hear the young, handsome, well-built man with a pale complexion. You know, you'll eventually get to that, but as I was reading that, I was like, this is kind of weird. I mean, why is he separating the sentences like this, almost in stanzas, right? But anyways, the way it was read by Peter Kenny made it a lot more clear in the audiobook. So, anyways, he's brought back to normal and becomes a man again, and the Witcher goes on his way. And that is the end of the first 2 chapters that we were assigned to read this week. All right, everybody. This was awesome. I'll see you again next Tuesday. There will be a shorter form of this, like I said, on YouTube later in the week, maybe on Friday or Saturday. It'll be posted. Also have a new video coming out on Monday. And, of course, our podcast will be broadcast on Sunday here on Twitch as well. So I will see you again very soon. Until then, read the next 2 chapters, take some notes, come in with some ideas for discussion, and I'll see you guys later. Peace out.